because I know he had some health issues. Apparently, he died of pneumonia, double pneumonia in both of his lungs in the prison. He was a very heavy smoker the last few years because you just see him chain smoking away, through videos. So that's not going to help if you've got health issues. I think he had heart issues. He did confirm it in one video, but it was like a fuck around, find out moment, and I don't get it.
So Gonzalo Lira, Ukraine's most notorious immigrant, has passed away in hospital while on trial in Kharkiv on the other side of Ukraine. Привit and greetings from Odessa, Mama. Now, I made a few videos reacting to Gonzalo Lira and his insane propaganda supporting Russia in its invasion and attack here on Ukraine. So it would be remiss of me not to make a reaction to his passing and look back at his career, shall we say, trying to help Russia in its war against Ukraine. And for Lira's supporters who will no doubt come across this video, you might be surprised by my reaction, because I am not very happy that he has passed away. So let's get into it. Поехали!
SAR Experience.
So it's now well over a month since Gonzalo Lira was reported to have died in detention in Ukraine awaiting trial. And I put off until now making a reaction video to his death. I did do a series of videos to him before the Russian extended invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, when he was known as Coach Red Pill, and afterwards when he was kind of crazily supporting every kind of conspiracy theory, anti-Ukrainian narrative propaganda at the beginning of this extended invasion. And the reasons that I put up making a reaction video, even though I've done several of them in the past, is number one, the last time that Gonzalo Lira was reported murdered by the Ukrainian Nazis by his hysterical followers, it turned out he had just actually been detained for about a week, and he was released and actually looked in better health after being detained by the Ukrainians than beforehand, ironically. And second of all, rather predictably, his death has become a kind of martyrdom now and is being instrumentalized by the anti-Ukraine, was a pro-Russian commentariat that pushes a lot of Kremlin talking points. Give you some examples, but of course, Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, David Sachs, all of these individuals are now using Gonzalo Lira's death to push a narrative that an American journalist was killed in Ukraine, and drawing a parallel with the death of Alexei Navalny, the Russian political dissident, in prison in Russia. To most normal people, very different situations. So in order to understand it better, I'm going to dive a little bit into the background of Gonzalo Lira, like who was he really, and give you analysis of the kind of activity he was engaged in and whether he should be considered, number one, a journalist, a dissident, or is he a propagandist and a modern day Lord Haha. Lord Haha was an American-born, Irish-raised, British propagandist for Nazi Germany during World War II. And he was actually buried in my hometown of Ireland, which is kind of an odd coincidence, and I've been a few times and filmed in front of his grave in Galway, Ireland, drawing a parallel between a lot of these modern-day Lord Hahas who support Russia in this war against Ukrainians and more broadly against the collective West. So let's look firstly at Gonzalo Lira's background. He was born in the US, very close to Hollywood, and that is an important point in his background. And he's the son of a rather wealthy, it appears, Chilean banker from a very influential Chilean family, and grew up between Chile and the US, and has citizenship from both countries, both an American citizen and a Chilean citizen. Now, when you dive into his background, it seems that really the only things of note from his time before he became an online personality was a rather mixed career as a fictional author in Spanish, in Chile, and in cinematography. Didn't seem like he really achieved a lot, but it is important that he was doing fiction. So for that, you need a very good imagination and be able to tell stories to captivate people. And those are skills that I will say that he managed to harness quite well for his later online career. Otherwise, it seems that even by his own admission, he was a pretty poor student. He failed engineering school in Chile, but then showed up in Dartmouth, which is a prestigious university in the US. I'm pretty sure it's an Ivy League technical university at Dartmouth. And interestingly, when you Google his name, Gonzalo Lira and Dartmouth, an article comes up where it seems that Gonzalo Lira had been convicted by the university and actually suspended for sexual assault. So there's this article, and it is on the Dartmouth, and it is the student newspaper of Dartmouth in the US. And here we have an article by Gonzalo Lira published on the 8th of February 1995. And I'll put a link to this whole article down below in the description to the video if you want to go read it yourself. But it appears in Gonzalo's own words that he was brought before the Committee on Standards, and basically he was suspended for 3 terms, having been found innocent of harassment but guilty of assault. And the assault that he's referring to was sexual assault. So it seems that whilst he wasn't prosecuted but in the courts, in his own words, he's describing that he was convicted of sexual assault by Dartmouth College, by their Committee on Standards. This is obviously a long time before the hashtag #MeToo movement, and yeah, sexual assault was a lot easier to get away with back in the day, and it wasn't taken as seriously. So I couldn't imagine today that he would have been found guilty of sexual assault by Committee on Standards at an Ivy League university and allowed to stay at all the university, not actually been prosecuted in the courts. But 1995 was very, very different to obviously 2024. It's like almost 30 years ago, and that was the zeitgeist at the time. So that is important to understand because of his content as Coach Red Pill, which was pretty basic red pill talking points or commentary that uses evolutionary biology and then quickly veers towards misogyny. So interesting that he had this issue of being guilty of sexual assault in his university days. So if you look on YouTube, you can still find some clips of Gonzalo Lira actually appearing as an economic expert. Not really sure why he was ever supposed to be an economic expert, but he seems to have run some sort of consultancy that's now defunct. And he appeared actually on Russia Today. And whilst Russia Today is kind of scrubbed from YouTube, you can find other people have uploaded an interview he did. I'll play a few seconds from it.
That is the end of Bretton Woods 2. I think that that would be the point where you'd start to see a run on the dollar.
Do you see the problems that you've warned all of us about as being emblematic of a loss of trust in the American economic experiment, or is American democracy safe and sound?
And I think that's interesting because obviously with the expanded invasion by Russia on February 24, 2022, Gonzalo Lira was cheering on Russia and spreading pro-Russian disinformation to try and hurt Ukraine from Ukraine. And it is interesting to note that he had previously appeared on Russia Today, which is a state propaganda arm for Russia in English. So another kind of interesting tidbit. Then, as I said, he became Coach Red Pill when I actually became familiar with his content first. He took these somewhat valid evolutionary biological analysis of terms that is part of the Red Pill philosophy, but then unfortunately, like nearly all these Red Pill YouTubers, they veer very quickly towards misogyny and hating women, and his content was definitely on the misogynist side.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're the guy lucky enough to be fucking these promiscuous whores, it's all good and well, but I mean, at some point, no matter how promiscuous you might be, you want to eventually find a girl and have a family and have children, and you don't want the mother of your children to be a fucking whore. He asked me, how do you raise a daughter so that, she's not a whore, basically. Matt has said it in much more polite language than I'm saying it now, but that was the crux of his question, How do you raise a daughter so that she's not a fucking whore?
He was particularly rude and abusive towards women on his channel, and, it is what it is. He was that type of content creator that blew up and became quite popular before he actually deleted nearly every video off his channel. I think he almost completely nuked his channel in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is kind of an interesting coincidence that he went and did that. Now, I made reaction videos to his content because he had been living in Kharkiv, partially, and it's kind of interesting. I did come across his divorce from his Ukrainian wife, and in that, it says that they were estranged for many years. So while he was making all this content, talking about his family and his Ukrainian wife, he actually appears to have had no contact with them, or very, very little contact with them. So I'm not really sure why he was still hanging out in Kharkiv. We'll go a little bit into that in more detail a little bit later in this video. It's very interesting to read the divorce judgment. But in general, when he was talking about dating in Ukraine, it's clear that this guy had no idea what it's like to actually date successfully as a single Western guy in Ukraine. He also didn't speak a lick of Ukrainian or Russian. Most people in Kharkiv before this invasion in 2022 would have used Russian in their daily life, but he didn't speak either language. He doesn't seem to have had many friends or anything. We'll go into that in a sec, why I believe that. And he was talking about basically it's like shooting fish in a barrel. All these girls, in Ukraine, they will just basically come for you because you're an American. But anyone who has come to Ukraine, in particular to Kharkiv, where very few young people actually even speak English, so I'm not sure who he was really even communicating with, know that in the dating trenches, that this is the polar opposite of what actually is the reality. Showing up as, like, Gonzalo Lira was in his 50s, obese, didn't seem to be taking care of himself in his presentation, and yeah, only speaking English. A guy like that has close to zero chance with women, with a big age gap. Other than, of course, just paying for prostitution. And that actually seems to be what he was doing, because he posted a clip showing how great it was in Kharkiv with a young prostitute.
Oh, yeah. The audience loves you, baby. The camera loves you.
Just the idea that a dating coach, inverted commas, someone giving life advice about dating and finding good women, is telling young men, come to Ukraine, it's so easy with women, and then paying for prostitutes and actually circling that as his kind of conquest is ridiculous. It just shows that he was a very stereotypical sexpat. He was a fat, 50-year-old sexpat loser. And okay, you do have some guys who fall into the trap of listening to people like Gonzalo and think that it's going to be just easy to come to a country like Ukraine. Could say the same really for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland. These guys really don't distinguish too much between all these places and think that, being American is going to get you the ladies. Is absolutely not the case. And he was a pretty sad figure. I would recommend to those guys, if you are one of those guys who come across this video, maybe you still have a chance on a remote Filipino island, being an obese 50-year-old with no local social circle or the language skills or anything other really than money to provide. Better off going there. You're not going to do very well in Ukraine, and that is why he was clearly paying for prostitutes as a sexpat. But ridiculous that he was then going online and painting all these fantastical stories about his dating success in Ukraine, or just in general. And that is tied back to the fact that he was primarily a fantasist. This guy was just a pathological liar Lira, and basically online he just told tall tales that grew him a following online and gave him a community. And he was pretty much almost certainly a complete loner and loser in Kharkiv himself. Again, didn't speak the local languages. I'm not really sure he would be able to talk to, estranged from his wife and kids, clearly just paying for hookers. Pretty pathetic. And actually, I came across a couple of videos by a Ukrainian YouTuber who'd actually been a fan of Gonzalo Lira and went to meet him in person. And in the comments and in a subsequent video that he made, he describes that basically Gonzalo Lira was overtly pro-Russia, invading Ukraine at the time. This is before, this is it was before February 24, 2022. I think it was like late 2021. And he was trying to create a community of very disenfranchised, disillusioned Western guys who hate the West and would come and hang out with him in Kharkiv.
The video when I met Gonzalo Lira in Kyiv, Ukraine, it happened just before the war. There was a lot of tension surrounding the military buildup of Russians around Ukraine at that time. It was, like I said, it was December of 2021. So naturally, the conversation with Gonzalo Lira turned into the war, right? Or the prospects of the war, or how likely it was that, there could be a war in this country, right? And understanding that I was in this room full of these anti-establishment people, I was really interested in figuring out what Gonzalo would think on this matter. What I found interesting is that he kind of set himself apart with like outlandish sort of comments and outlandish sort of projections about how things would go. He was convinced about three things, I would say, right? I think number one, he was convinced that Russia, of the strength of Russia and how Russia would take over Ukraine if it really wanted to. He was especially convinced of the Russian sentiment in eastern Ukraine, which again is not true. The second thing is that he kind of overemphasized the importance, the economic importance and the political importance of eastern Ukraine. It has a huge economic potential. It had a lot of natural resources. It sort of, didn't really need to be part of Ukraine because it could like fend for itself. It could sustain itself, essentially. It could sustain itself. Again, that's kind of like not rooted in reality. Number three, he kind of did hint at the notion of Ukrainian disintegration as sort of like, like I said, Ukraine, couldn't necessarily stay united if push came to shove. And again, it didn't sit well with me, even at that point. It didn't sit well with me. I thought he was kind of like silly. I kind of tried to, to mention that it's wrong and there's no way that Ukraine will capitulate. There's no way that Ukraine is divided, Ukraine is united. And didn't really sit well with me about him was his undermining of Ukraine. Like it's always this undermining of Ukraine. Why are you undermining it? What's your point? Is trying to sound edgy, trying to sound cool, trying to sound different, to be on Russia's side. Well, if you're on Russia's side, why don't you go back to Russia? You're sitting here in Kyiv, in the capital. But of course, like I said, when you're sitting in a room full of people who are anti-establishment or who are from the West but criticize it, don't like it, they come to Ukraine for an alternative. Maybe they are, sort of hell-bent on thinking that way. They kind of want to gather around each other, like sort of drink their own Kool-Aid.
So, yeah, he actually called it, I found some reference to an online Project Mayhem, a bit like in Fight Club. And he encouraged his followers to go and put toothpicks in locks and all this kind of weird stuff as kind of like, I guess, some low-level dissident behavior in the West, kind of like freaky. He was trying to create this kind of dissident retreat. And then he suddenly nuked his Gonzalo, it was called Coach Red Pill, his channel, and basically deleted nearly all his content about dating. And he suddenly appeared on a pro-Russian political commentary, geopolitical channel called the Duran as their man in Kharkiv, underground Ukraine. And I actually watched one of their videos, one of their live streams, because in February 2022 I was in Ukraine, and my personal safety and my life was basically on the line, and I already had that US intelligence that they released that Russia was planning to invade. So I was actually making my evacuation plans, but at the same time I wanted to listen to other opinions that would be the opposite for me. So actually that's why I watched their channel, even though it's obviously a pro-Russian channel. And I wanted to see what they'd say. Basically, they were discussing the fake news invasion of Ukraine by Russia, saying it's all Western hysteria and propaganda. And I was listening to it, and Gonzalo Lira was basically insulting anyone that possibly think that Russia would now invade again Ukraine. He was like, I'm here in Kharkiv, and yeah, I can see Russia from my house, kind of comments, and there are no Russian tanks, and only someone with low IQ would think that Russia is going to now invade Kharkiv, the city, which is actually, of course, what happened. And I was sitting there thinking, okay, these guys aren't really giving me too many reasons to believe their analysis. It just seems like they're insulting anyone that listens to what the US State Department is actually advising. And then they went on for over half an hour, more or less, about Jake Sullivan, who is the National Security Advisor. with all these fantasies about why he was pushing this propaganda, in inverted commas, that Russia was going to invade Ukraine or extend their invasion, because obviously they already invaded in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and then also the war in Donbass.
I'm lovely to be here talking to you guys. I'm here in Kharkov, eastern Ukraine, 40 kilometers from the Russian border. And as I look out my window, I can see the Russian tanks are rolling down. Oh, wait, no, it's an interurban bus. My mistake. You know.
Well, thank you for taking some time out of the invasion day to speak with us.
The invasion date is tomorrow, the 16th.
Well, the pre-invasion date.
Pre-invasion date. But on Friday it was today.
And I was thinking to myself, like, this is not entertainment for me. I'm really trying to figure out, do I need to evacuate or not? Or is this exaggerated? And I was just looking at saying, these guys are just making it all up. They have all these crazy fantasies about how is Jake Sullivan doing X, Y, and Z, and they mention other big political figures and how it's all a big basic conspiracy. And as it turns out, of course, I made the right decision by just ignoring everything those clowns said. So next point I want to just point out is, isn't it strange that Gonzalo Lira, who's first appeared on Russia Today as an economic expert, and previously obviously he'd worked in fiction, both as an author and as a filmmaker, that then he becomes this pretty big figure online, advising normally young men in the West with respect to relationships and dating, that he suddenly deletes all his content, seems to try and create some sort of dissident retreat in Kharkiv, where he is an immigrant, completely non-integrated, doesn't speak the local languages, doesn't appear to have any local friends, estranged from his wife and kids, that suddenly he shows up, having had these previous contacts with Russia Today and appearing as their economic expert, on the main geopolitical Russian, pro-Russian YouTube channel, with a very similar figure to himself in terms of look and a little bit overlapping background. Isn't it odd? So he was obviously pro the invasion. He'd said it to this other Ukrainian YouTuber who went and met him. Very strange that he was still in Kharkiv. Don't know if he had been told to be there, or it might be in his interest to be there to comment. It's definitely strange. I don't think that Vladimir Putin told too many people he's actually going to launch the extended invasion. It was pretty obvious a few days before, but at that stage I had already pre-positioned myself near the Romanian-Moldovan border in Chernovtsi. I was well out of dangerous way. Thankfully, millions of other people weren't, and one of them was, of course, Gonzalo Lira, because he didn't leave. He decided to stay, and he started his insane pro-Russian disinformation campaign from Kiev, because he happened to be in Kiev on day one of the invasion. I just remember a few mad things that he was saying, like at the beginning when Kiev was in danger of being overrun by the Russian forces, although that obviously didn't transpire to be the case in the end. Ukraine gave out a lot of small arms to the civilian population that was willing to resist the Russian invaders, and also that dealt a lot with pro-Russian saboteurs because it was harder for them to operate in the city, whilst their main forces were obviously outside or in the suburbs of the city. And Gonzalo Lira walked around the center of Kyiv saying that, Zelensky's giving out all these guns and people are terrified here of the Ukrainians with the small arms. When they're obviously getting attacked by rockets, artillery, and there are saboteurs operating in the city shooting people. And he's trying to present it that, no, the people are really scared of the Ukrainians here.
That's something that the Western media is not talking about, of how the Zelensky regime, by handing out weapons, has basically given weapons to all the criminal elements in the city. And the criminal elements in the city are, first of all, figuring out their dominance hierarchy and this anarchy that the government has created.
Obviously a completely illogical, buffoonish claim to make, without any evidence, of course. And he walked around saying this. He also seemed to try to dox some Western journalists. He was like sending basically their locations to, publishing it online. And eventually he was asked to leave the hotel. He went back to Kharkiv and continued this kind of insane pro-Russian propaganda line while in Ukraine. And that's what made him unique, is the fact that he did not leave Ukraine. He stayed in the city, or stayed in the country that he was trying to undermine the defense of, and doing it openly right? So in the past, someone like Lord Haw back in World War II, he actually had to leave the United Kingdom because he didn't have a way, realistically, to publish his disinformation or pro-Nazi propaganda at the time. He actually went to Nazi Germany and then was a radio host where he was then obviously transmitting that back to the UK, but he was obviously in the safety and sanctuary of Nazi Germany at the time. Gonzalo Lira, with YouTube and self-publication, was able to do that actually from the ground, and he wasn't arrested and detained for quite a number of months. It was a few months before he actually was arrested. I alluded to that in the beginning when his hysterical followers claimed he'd been murdered by the Nazis, which of course he wasn't. So basically he went on with all this propaganda. He had at one point Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, which is part of Russia, he actually started to circulate Gonzalo Lira's videos with Russian subtitles saying, look, this American on the ground agrees with everything we're saying. Basically. So that was how he's been instrumentalized by the Russian side. Obviously, the purpose, I mean, he was claiming, Ukraine's doing biolabs, whatever crazy conspiracy theory there is against Ukraine, Gonzalo Lira was publishing it. I remember when the last post he made on his Telegram channel was, there's a park in the center of Kharkiv, I'm pretty sure it was Shevchenko Park, and there was an artillery attack on the park. It was close enough to front lines. There was some sort of rocket attack, and it was partially damaged by this. So obviously, Russia's attacking the city, and yeah, the presumption would be that there are Russian rockets coming in, unless you saw some like overwhelming evidence to say the opposite. No, for Gonzalo Lira, he had some fantasy post about, oh, it can only be the Zelensky regime because they're so evil. Again, just lying and making stuff up. And what was the purpose of this? The very clear purpose, which has come to light 2 years later, is that he was trying to undermine Western support for Ukraine, because Ukraine is and was very dependent on the amount of arms that they could get from the US, from the UK. UK and the US were big supporters in 2022, probably exceeded expectations about how much they were going to supply to Ukraine. And there was a huge groundswell of support for Ukraine in most of Europe and in North America and in other parts of the world like Australia, New Zealand, that we could call the collective West. So he was pushing all this pro-Russian disinformation, because it is disinformation, to try and undermine that support. And we see 2 years later, with this impasse for Ukrainian aid in the US House of Representatives, the US Congress overall, that it has now been successful 2 years later, but it wasn't successful back then in 2022 when he's pushing this. So that is kind of his malevolent objective in pushing this pro-Russian propaganda. Remember, he is an immigrant in Ukraine. He is a guest. He's a very unintegrated immigrant. He doesn't speak the local languages after many years of being there. He's estranged from his Ukrainian wife and kids. He doesn't really have any reason to be there in the country. I mean, I guess, it's not written that I could find, but I guess he probably had permanent residency because of him having a Ukrainian wife and children. He would be eligible for that. So he had some sort of residency there. He is a guest in Ukraine. He's not a Ukrainian citizen. And he is trying to aid and abet the invading Russian army through disinformation and through the informational, I guess, warfare space that both sides engage in. I mean, psychological and information is part of fighting a war, not just with tanks and bombs, also trying to undermine the will of either side. And obviously, Ukraine was largely dependent on Western arms supplies, as they still are today, and now it's been undermined. So that is the purpose of why he was doing this. And we see now a reappearance of a lot of the same disinformation or propaganda points that Gonzalo Lira was pushing back in 2022, in particular, like Ukraine can never win. He was sitting there in Kharkiv, I guess, pleading for the Russian forces to come and liberate him personally, since he was obviously acting against the interests of the country that he was an immigrant to, that it's so, and very disingenuous, they will say, oh, it's so sad that those Ukrainian soldiers are dying en masse. If you care for Ukrainian people dying, and in fact, on the other side, Russian soldiers dying, then you should be completely against Russia and pushing for Russia to, pleading for Russia, just leave Ukraine and go home. Russians need to go home. That's the solution to that. It's not Ukrainian soldiers not having any weapons to defend themselves and defend Ukrainian civilians. And then, as we've seen with many of the massacres of civilians in occupied territories, the ones that have been now re-liberated by Ukraine, what happened there, that is what he was campaigning for. He was campaigning for those kind of scenarios in the city that he had made his home to a certain extent as an immigrant. A pretty despicable person. And, you know, not a guy with many moral qualms about what he's doing, obviously. So let's take a look at Gonzalo Lira's legal travails in Ukraine. So he was picked up by the SBU. We held a melodrama where he had seeded the idea that he might be abducted and murdered by the Nazis in Ukraine. That obviously played pretty well with his fanatical, hysterical audience.
Unfortunately for Gonzo Lira, it seems it was.
He was detained, I think, for about a week and then released. And he was picked up not just because of his propaganda, but also allegations that he doxed not just the Western journalists in Kiev, but also members of the Ukrainian military. That is illegal. There is martial law in Ukraine. Your normal rights are restricted in a time of martial law. This is one of the effects of martial law. And Ukraine is in this existential fight for survival, with Russia obviously having an extended invasion of the country, threatening the capital, Kiev, and also Kharkiv, where Gonzalo Lira had been apparently living. You know, there was all this hysteria around his arrest from his followers, in particular Scott Ritter, who's no stranger on this channel because I've reacted to some of his mad ramblings about the war as well, which turned out to be completely incorrect. And Scott Ritter actually wrote lots of messages in support of Gonzalo Lira, but after Gonzalo Lira's release, he actually distanced himself from Scott Ritter. So Scott Ritter has some previous convictions for illegal sexual activity with minors. You can Google what they were exactly. And actually, Gonzalo Lira called him out on this and distanced himself from him.
I think that this is his game, to try to get in good with the mainstream crowd. To try to get in good, to earn a nice paycheck from some nice think tank. The man is 60 years old, and because of the various personal circumstances that he's been involved in, and as I understand it, there was a stint in jail.
And Scott Ritter did not react well to this, and he labeled Gonzalo Lira and SBU informants. SBU are the security services in Ukraine.
I know how these operations work. There is no other way to describe this other than that he was a controlled SBU asset. He was arrested, charged with crimes that bring the death penalty. He was released and allowed to do the exact same thing while under house arrest.
And this is important to note about what would have happened potentially if Gonzalo Lira had lived long enough to be convicted in Ukraine, and whether he would have been exchanged in any sort of release with the Russian side. Because Scott Ritter has a lot of influence in Russia. He goes there quite regularly, promotes his book. He's a little bit of a celebrity, I guess, as an American who supports Russia so openly and enthusiastically in their war, not just with Ukraine, but against his own home country. I mean, Vladimir Putin seems to think he's at war with the entire West. That's the conflict, not just with Ukraine. So Scott Ritter goes and gives speeches in front of the Chechen leader, Kadyrov, in pretty hard to understand Russian when he spoke, but he's been pictured lots of times with Russian military figures and political figures. So having Scott Ritter against you, which would have been the case with Gonzalo Lira, probably would affect the chances of him actually getting exchanged. So about 8 months go by, actually I think it's 10 months go by, and what does Gonzalo Lira do? He doesn't try to leave Ukraine. He doesn't just sit in Kharkiv and keep his mouth shut now that he's actually been detained. No, he just goes on as before and makes this insane pro-Russian propaganda from Kharkiv, even after he was detained and released. And it was almost on a daily basis. I didn't have time to watch it, even though I made the previous reaction videos. It's just like, yeah, I'm not going to keep watching this guy. It's just insane propaganda. It's detached from reality, and he's just making up stuff all the time. And anyone who follows him, there isn't much hope for them, because I already made 3 videos debunking what he says. So what difference is going to make to these people if you make 10 or 20? They just want to be part of this community that supports Russia and that just buys into all this kind of cult-like propaganda that he propagates. And he kept going on the same shows and been part of this network that was of influencers, we'll say, primarily on YouTube, that are supporting Russia in their war. One of them was Donbas Devushka, who was claiming to be a woman from Donbas in Ukraine who supported Russia, but actually turned out to be an American woman just pretending to be Russian. But that was the level of credibility you need to be part of this community. Yeah, just an insane rabble, basically, with, unfortunately, a hungry audience on YouTube because they get a certain number of views, so there is a market. And Gonzalo Lira was making money out of that. He had a Patreon, and that's also relevant to some of the other issues that he had, because as we'll see, he also claimed that he got extorted while he was in prison in Ukraine later. So in May 2023, Gonzalo Lira was arrested once again, and actually this time it was filmed and publicized, and by the SBU, quite dramatic. He was charged with violating Article 436-2 of Ukraine's criminal code, which is justifying Russian against Ukraine. You cannot be in Ukraine and justifying Russian aggression. As I said, there's martial law. Ukraine is in a war of existential survival against the Russian invaders. And not only had Lira on multiple occasions publicly justified Russia's attack on Ukraine, denied Russian missile attacks on Ukraine, on Ukrainian cities, and the mass killings and war crimes of, for example, Bucha, etc. I mean, he just nonstop, whatever is the narrative to promote Russia, he was going to say it, and that's what he was doing. That you can't do that and live as an immigrant in Ukraine. I think for most sane people, they understand why, that you can't do that. He's a blogger, after all. He's not even a journalist. And I think a journalist who went and do that, would they be detained and charged? They certainly would be deported at a very minimum and be persona non grata in Ukraine at this time of war. I don't think if America got invaded by, let's say, Mexico, and they were trying to occupy New Mexico or California or something, that being a foreigner, an immigrant in the US, and publicizing propaganda on a daily basis to support the Mexican invaders, in that case, that you would be at a very minimum permitted to stay in. So at a certain point, a few months later, Gonzalo Lira is actually released on bail, pending his trial. And what does he do? He decides to go to the border and try to abscond, flee Ukraine, and violate the terms of his bail. So remember, the Ukrainians have released him. He's not sitting in the cell. So he gets released on bail. He decides to violate that. He makes these videos from where he says it's the border between Ukraine and Hungary, and that he's about to try to abscond and not stay for his trial. And then he's chain smoking again. He doesn't look in good health. Again, there's a big long spiel about how he was tortured in prison, but he doesn't produce any evidence. It's just him rambling about it. And he says there's this plot by the guards, and they get the other prisoners to extort money from him. And yeah, I mean, again, he's just telling these tall tales. I mean, he doesn't even, in his own accounts, it's just him speculating that it's the guards, right? So again, he just makes a lot of stuff up. Doesn't provide any evidence that's what's happening. But again, this obviously plays very well with his audience, who wants to believe that the Ukrainian Nazis are torturing him and extorting money from whatever, even though he's not providing any evidence to support that. And of course, he's the one breaking the law again by absconding. And just think about it. The Ukrainians are that bad. Why are they letting him out all the time on bail? And the first time they just let him away, kind of with a warning, it seemed. If he just stopped making the videos, maybe he wouldn't have got rearrested. Who knows? And this is part of his strategy in terms of creating drama. He also did the same before his first arrest in 2022. He posted at the top, he pinned at the top a tweet where he added himself to a list of people that had, he claims, been disappeared by the Ukrainian government or murdered for being dissidents. But when you go and read through the list of people added himself to, some of them actually were killed. I think one or two, or they were detained, or they were arrested. But they all seem to have been collaborators with the Russian invasion. So he basically added himself to a list of collaborators that should be detained in these circumstances. So again, he's a guy who's just really looking for some sort of martyrdom, or to become a cause célèbre in some sort, because he's adding himself to a list of people who are clearly enemies of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people. But again, to his audience, look, he's seeding it before he gets arrested. Oh, look, you know, I'm a dissident kind of, or I'm not sure what he's supposed to be really, because he's at the same time, his supporters are claiming that he's a journalist, but he's not a journalist if that's what he's doing, if he's added himself to a list of collaborators with the Russian invaders anyways. But kind of the same thing, he claims in this video on the Ukraine-Hungarian border that he's going to die in prison, that he won't survive. Well, you know, if you keep chain smoking and you're obese and you have pre-existing health conditions, then there's a high chance you're going to die in a Ukrainian prison because public health services in Ukraine are not the best. And, you know, when he was on bail, he had access, presumably, to private healthcare in Ukraine, which is actually pretty fine. And he, with the amount of money he was making from his propaganda, he could easily afford to pay for that, never mind the wealth he probably had from before. So yeah, he's kind of seeding again that he's in bad health and probably without really good healthcare, he's probably going to die pretty soon. Again, is that Ukraine's fault that he can't stop smoking and he's obese and yeah, he's put himself in this position? Absolutely not. Why is he entitled to amazing healthcare in a Ukrainian prison? That's not the standard that Ukrainian prisoners get. So his attempts to escape were unsuccessful. He was detained at the border trying to abscond as a fugitive. No big surprise there. Good to see the Ukrainian border controls worked pretty well had they stopped him. He had said he was going to apply for asylum in Hungary. I don't understand why he didn't try to flee to Russia. Maybe it was just not practically possible for him to cross that border. Surely the Russians are going to be sympathetic to him, but who knows? He had upset Scott Ritter, so maybe he wouldn't have been welcome in Russian as if he had actually tried to do that, ironically. And yeah, I mean, he's clearly violating the law 100%, whether you agree with the law or not in Ukraine. He is an immigrant there. He's a guest in the country. And when you read his divorce judgment, and his divorce was, let me just pull it up here, I think it was like December 22nd, 2022. It's interesting because in the judgment, at the very beginning, it talks about how Gonzalo Lira had actually immigrated to Ukraine and gotten permanent resident with his children, who, I mean, I assume they're Ukrainian citizens because their mother is Ukrainian. I'm not sure where they were born. I'm not sure if that's written in the judgment, but he has a Ukrainian wife and 2 children. So they moved to Ukraine for long-term residence, which you're entitled to as a foreigner if you have a Ukrainian wife, as long as you're still together, or if you have Ukrainian children. So that's what would have allowed him to become a permanent resident. But this is like it says the fall, so autumn 2016. But within 2 months, he actually left. That's what is written in the divorce judgment. And he went to work in the UK and then went on, according to Gonzalo Lira, this is what it says, to work in other countries. And then in 2017, it says in the judgment that he was only periodically visiting Ukraine, that in the spring of 2018, his wife received a message from an unknown woman on her phone that saying that she was having sex with Gonzalo Lira and asking to know if they were indeed separated. This apparently led to really a separation between his wife and children and Gonzalo Lira. So at that stage, he was separated. She took the kids. I mean, it doesn't seem like Gonzalo Lira was actually really in Ukraine with them in the first place. He didn't seem to have much contact with them in reality. So that seems to have ended that. And there's a lot of other allegations in the divorce judgment about his physical abuse. That's what's alleged here in Chile of an autistic young nephew, physical abuse by Gonzalo Lira and other things. But these are allegations in the divorce judgment in Ukraine. So I think we can only really discuss the fact that he was separated from his wife and kids for a long time. So all these stories he had in his channel about his children and doing X, Y, and Z, it was completely fabricated. The guy was separated. He didn't have this contact with him. He was lying the whole time. When he was Coach Red Pill, he was just taking these Red Pill talking points and extrapolating and making up all these stories. So again, interesting to see just looking through the different legal processes and the divorce judgment. Yeah, the guy basically, he broke the law. He wouldn't stop doing it. Yeah, he just, he was lying about the whole situation with his wife and children all the time. Because I actually wondered when the extended invasion happened on, late February 2022, why isn't he evacuating his family out of the country? He's supposed to be this red pill figure, and they promote traditional values and be masculine, but why isn't he taking care of his family first? I mean, I did an interview with an American who was in the Ukrainian military, Alex Tobiasen, and that's the first thing he did, is he got his Ukrainian girlfriend out of the country, and then he came back, right, to Ukraine, and then he signed up. He did that the first day. Gonzalo Lira was running around doing pro-Russian propaganda, surely potentially endangering his family. So apparently we now know the reason from the divorce judgment. He just didn't have any contact with them, really. So again, liar Lira. Yeah, there are these legal travails. Then, of course, he died awaiting trial. And that's the point I want to come to. I'm upset that he died in prison, because I wanted to see this guy convicted. He's clearly breaking the law. He's clearly a collaborator. He's not some objective journalist. He'd been working for RT and had contacts with them before. He's on channels with people who work for Russia, who have worked in the past with Russia, who do Russian propaganda. He was, he's given enough chances by the Ukrainians. He wasn't a high priority, obviously. He was arrested and warned, from what I understood the first time. He just kept making this ridiculous pro-Russian propaganda, which is illegal with the situation in Ukraine, where he's an immigrant. He could have just stopped doing it and probably left in reality, and he didn't want to do that. He wanted this situation, and it angers me that he didn't stay alive long enough so he could be convicted, so he could spend his time in jail, and then maybe be exchanged. Although I said I think that was low probability because of this clash he had with Scott Ritter. I think that probably would have made it pretty hard. And yeah, maybe he could have got back some Ukrainian defenders, maybe the American journalist Gersevich, who's currently imprisoned in Russia. Even Tucker Carlson thinks is not really a spy, and that he's basically, he's been held for exchange ransom of some, ransom being exchanged of other prisoners held in the US or somewhere else that's allied with Ukraine or Ukraine. That maybe he could have gotten back some, Gersevich, or maybe he could have gotten back some Ukrainian heroes, right? Some Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia, real men, not like this scumbag. He could have, in extremis, done something productive for Ukraine. But no, he just couldn't stop chain smoking cigarettes, and being obese and ruining his health and dying in Ukrainian prison of pneumonia. That's the sad reality.
What could he have done? There's nothing he could have done, bro. Honestly, there was nothing he could have done. The only thing he could have honestly done was do nothing, which, obviously he's not going to do, which is not say a word about the conflict.
If that was you, what would you do?
I would have done the same shit.
Died a martyr?
Yeah. Because now, he stood for something.
After this episode, a couple weeks pass, months pass, what's going to happen? People forget. His kids are still there. His wife, his kids. I mean, listen, bro. I get it being a martyr, but goddamn, bro. Like, you got a family, bro. That sucks.
So originally I thought I would conclude this video because I give advice to guys who want to come and relocate to this region. And the very obvious advice is don't be a martyr for Russian fascism, and don't chain smoke, and be obese, and yeah, just live this very destructive lifestyle. But I don't think anyone else, in spite of what that Mr. Fit there said, no one else is really planning, in all likelihood, to come and be a martyr for pro-Russian fascism in Ukraine. He was kind of a unique case, Gonzalo Lira, that he really wanted to die for that cause here. And whilst there are lots of Putin fanboys like these guys that I've just reacted to, that ignominious distinction of dying for Russian fascism as an American goes solely to Gonzalo, the liar Lira. And soon he will be forgotten.